Day 12, ladies and gents, of the war in the Middle East, but in the year that just keeps on giving. Toss over a WarFronts for the E's, thank you so much. We had to make room for what's shaping up to be the next domino. An American operation, another one, against Cuba. A friendly takeover. That's how Donald Trump is describing what might be coming down the pipe for Havana. And he's certainly laying the groundwork. The effective siege the US has implemented since January is really starting to bite. Last month was the first month the island received zero oil imports from any source. Not less than usual, not a little, zero. It's reached the point where planes can't land there because there's not enough fuel to get them back up in the air, and hospitals have indefinitely suspended just about any non-life-threatening procedure. But the fall of the regime in Havana has been unsuccessfully predicted for over half a century at this point, and given that the US has its hands just a little busy over in the Middle East, what might this really mean for the island? And will it truly become Trump's next military target? The siege. Now, when we covered Cuba on our sister channel Homefronts back in January, it was in the immediate fallout from the arrest of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. The island was already in pretty rough shape, rolling blackouts were a daily fixture of life, the economy was in shambles, and the grid had suffered multiple nationwide collapses over the previous year that the government barely managed to patch back together each time. But while it was clear that Havana would be squarely in the administration's sights moving forward, especially through completely cutting it off from its energy lifeline in Caracas, actual regime change there was still something of a hypothetical. A big reason for that? Back then, it was Iran that we told you would be next. Well, we can see how that prediction played out, which freed up the on-deck position, and all indications are that it has since been filled by Cuba. What's happened in the 2 months since our last episode is that the cut-off of Venezuelan oil turned out to be the beginning of an even more expansive campaign to sever every dollar, every barrel, and every escape route that the regime has left. On the energy front specifically, something that had largely gone unnoticed was that Mexico had overtaken Venezuela as Cuba's largest oil supplier last year, and in the immediate fallout of the operation, Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum initially committed to honoring those contracts, not increasing them, but delivering what they had already signed up for, framing the issue as both a sovereign and humanitarian matter. And to her credit, one tanker did arrive in Havana in January. It was still a fraction of what the island actually needed, though, and even this would not last. On January the 29th, the Trump administration issued Executive Order 14,380, declaring a national emergency, enabling the president to impose tariffs that targeted any country that directly or indirectly sells or provides oil to Cuba. The critical detail is the scope of that treaty. The order authorized additional duties on all imports from offending countries, not just energy products, meaning that for Mexico, continued shipments to Havana risked triggering penalties across the entire USMCA trade relationship almost immediately. Sheinbaum acknowledged shortly thereafter that deliveries were currently halted. She described it as a sovereign decision amid fluctuations, but the timing left little mystery about what really was behind the move. Mexico pivoted to humanitarian aid only, shipping food and medicine, while zero crude moved to the island. Now, Havana isn't entirely isolated on the world stage, and Russia has made sporadic attempts to run tankers through, but US threats against third-party shippers have deterred anything meaningful, at least so far. The physical infrastructure to process what little might arrive is similarly disappearing. A refinery fire on February 13th temporarily put the plant out of commission, and even before that, the island's field reserves had dwindled to the point that commercial flights were largely cancelled last month as airports simply ran out of jet fuel. While the oil blockade has gotten headlines, and deservedly so, it sits atop a financial strangulation campaign that in some ways has been even more methodical, and much of it was already in motion before Maduro was ever arrested. The Cuba restricted list, which bars American citizens and entities from transacting with hundreds of military and intelligence-linked Cuban organizations, was reinstated on day one of the second Trump term. The administration wasted precious little time in expanding the original list too. Orbit, one of the last remaining channels through which US dollars were still reaching the island in the form of remittances, was added. This effectively severed the last financial inflows of currency from abroad. Beyond finance, the administration has also hit the regime's two biggest non-oil sources of hard currency: Cuba's medical brigade program, which sends doctors abroad in what critics describe as a forced labor export scheme, and tourism. In the case of the former, new visa restrictions on Cuba and third-country officials involved in administering these programs are designed to cut off the pipeline at its source. Tourism, the other lifeline, has been hit from both travel restrictions that were reimposed and tightened and the fuel shortages that threw most of the country into chronic rolling blackouts. Things that make for somewhat less than a luxury getaway. The combined effect of all of this is an island currently running out of almost everything at once: fuel, dollars, food, all of which raises the obvious question: what exactly is Washington's goal here? And before we get into the back-channel negotiations and administrative goals, a quick note about Fronts.co. Fronts.co is our subscriber site for those who want to go deeper on stories just like this one. Every week we publish 2 exclusive videos and 2 expert articles that don't make it onto the main channel. Think of it as a way of digging deeper into the stories that interest you the most. Right now, you won't be surprised to hear that we're putting out a lot of Iran bonus content, ranging from videos on what it's like for those living inside the country right now to expert articles on how Gulf states can deal with the Iranian drone threat. But we also go deeper on stories from across the globe, including in-depth analysis of the Venezuela operation and long-standing questions like whether Latin America can ever win the war on drugs. Basically, if you want more of this type of analysis, it's $5 per month or $50 a year. And it's worth a look if this is the kind of thing you follow closely. And now, let's see what the administration has lined up for Cuba. The strategy. The speed at which the administration's rhetoric has escalated over Cuba tells you everything you need to know about where Washington thinks this is headed, and the confidence that it has in getting there. On January 3rd, the day of the Maduro raid, when the dust was still settling and analysts were scrambling to figure out if this would be part of a broader campaign in the region, Trump was almost casual about future relationships with Havana, quoting, "I think Cuba is going to be something we'll end up talking about because Cuba is a failing nation right now." Just a day later, he waved off the idea of military action entirely, saying it wouldn't be necessary because, quote, "it looks like it's going down," end quote, on its own. 2 months later, though, the tone has changed. This March, the president began to use the phrase friendly takeover for the first time. What's striking here, though, is how little of the strategy behind that rhetoric actually involves the military. Now, this is almost certainly influenced by the fact that Washington is currently engaged in the largest military operation since the Iraq War back in 2003. But this can only explain so much. It was pretty clear even before the US build-up in the Middle East that they had their sights on Tehran militarily, which just isn't the case here. Representative Carlos Jimenez, one of the most hawkish Cuban-American members of Congress, titled an op-ed, "Cuba is approaching its Berlin Wall moment." Now, for the younger members of our audience, part of what made the Berlin Wall's fall so famous was that it did not involve a military deployment, but rather a popular movement of the people after the system around it had rotted out. And that is the bet that Washington appears to be making here, that the Cuban regime and its legitimacy is rotting faster than it can patch the holes, and that patience costs essentially nothing, while an invasion would cost a great deal. And based on the numbers, it's hard to argue with them. February 2026 was, as we mentioned earlier, the first month in over a decade where Cuba received 0 oil imports from any source. Perhaps unsurprisingly then, the grid is running at half capacity on its good days, with analysts warning that complete fuel depletion could arrive within weeks. And this extends well beyond just the energy sector. In late February, Secretary of State Marco Rubio flew straight from Trump's State of the Union address to a CARICOM summit, a bloc that had long been one of Havana's most reliable allies for over 50 years. By the end of the day, he told reporters that virtually every leader in the room agreed Cuba's status quo was unacceptable. The question then isn't whether the pressure campaign is working. It clearly is, insofar as it's making life miserable on the island. No, the real question is whether this pressure can actually lead to a change in government. Earlier this month, we got some indications that the administration believes it can. Sourced to officials with direct knowledge of the talks, back-channel negotiations for what some are calling Cuba's Troika, a plan in which the US would loosen sanctions on energy, ports, and tourism and allow direct American investment in exchange for a negotiated political exit for President Miguel Diaz-Canel. The man Rubio has been talking to is none other than Raul Castro's 41-year-old grandson, believed to be the one to oversee GESA, the military conglomerate that is the heart of the Cuban economy. GESA's scale is difficult to overstate. Its gross profits represent close to 37% of Cuba's GDP, its exports account for roughly a third of the island's total, and its total revenues are more than 3 times greater than the entire Cuban state budget. Leaked documents have also reportedly shown the conglomerate holding as much as $18 billion in hard currency, a sizable portion of the ailing island's total annual GDP. But critically, what was missing from this plan was any framework for a democratic transition, including free elections, opposition parties, or a human rights overhaul. And the exile community has not been thrilled, to say the least. Jose Daniel Ferrer, one of Cuba's most prominent opposition leaders in exile, has warned Rubio directly against any Venezuela-style pact that preserves the regime's power structure, saying such a move would be a mistake that would invite new crises later down the road. All that said, Rubio is himself the son of Cuban exiles and was a senator from the state to which the vast majority fled. And for anyone who spent any time interacting with Miami's Cuban population, it takes all of about 5 seconds to learn what the general consensus is on the regime in Havana. This is, in other words, not a man who grew up exactly admiring the Castro family. Taking a hard line against the government there has consistently been at the heart of his foreign policy. One potential reading is that the Cuba Troika framing represents an ongoing position, replacing the man at the top with someone more willing to reform and from there get to work on what's to come. But whatever Washington's endgame turns out to be, the pressure campaign isn't waiting for the diplomats to sort it out, and neither is the Cuban grid. Countdown to 0 hour. So when we talk about rolling blackouts, the occasional power outages that we all experience from time to time with bad storms might come to mind. A nuisance. I mean, maybe for a particularly long one, you won't be able to charge your phone for a while, or worst of all, you might be cut off from our coverage here on WarFronts until things get back to normal. No. Wait. What happens in Cuba is a different universe. On March the 4th, the Guterres thermoelectric plant, the same aging facility whose collapse in October 2024 plunged most of the island into darkness, went down once again, and this time it took 2/3 of the island with it. It was repaired within 4 days, but by then the damage was done, and in any case, the grid that came back online was still running at less than half the country's demand. During the crisis, Cuba was producing about 1,200 megawatts against a need for over 2,200, and the blackouts that used to last 12 to 14 hours have now stretched past 20. In other words, chronic mismanagement and a 2-month blockade have managed to do to Cuba's power grid what it took the Kremlin 4 years of constant bombardments to do to Ukraine's. What that means in practice is that daily life in Cuba has reverted to something closer to pre-industrial. Refrigerators are next to useless, given how long the blackouts last for, so perishable goods are often impossible to store. Most of Havana's garbage trucks are sitting idle without fuel, so trash is piling up for weeks at a time and ultimately ends up getting burned in the street. Over 80% of the country's water pumping infrastructure runs on electricity, meaning that when the power goes down, so does the water, and close to 1 million Cubans depend on tanker trucks that themselves need fuel to operate. Families have taken to filling buckets during the few hours with power each day, rushing to complete every basic task before the lights cut out again. The institutional level of things is as severe, if not worse. Hospitals have more or less suspended non-emergency surgeries nationwide, and the healthcare system that was once the pride of the regime is operating, by the health minister's own admission, on the verge of collapse. The UN's Humanitarian Office reported this week that some 16,000 cancer patients awaiting radiotherapy and over 12,000 dependent on chemotherapy are unable to receive treatment, while ambulances across the island are struggling to obtain fuel for emergency runs. Analysts have started to use the term 0 hour for the time when the reserves finally run dry, and reports are beginning to point to mid to late March as a timeline for that. And given that we are recording this on the 11th of March, that really isn't very far away, is it? Washington's bet is that conditions like these will eventually produce one of two outcomes. Either the regime negotiates its own exit, or the Cuban people force one. And on the surface, that theory makes some sense, even if it is rather grim for the people there, and will certainly lead to loss of life. In the days after the March 4th blackout, protests erupted across multiple Havana neighborhoods and spread across the island to cities like Matanzas, with people chanting "freedom" and "down with communism." And for Cubans who might rather leave than fight, that option has more or less dried up as well. Allowing critics of the government to leave the country was for years a not-so-secret release valve, one less political dissident or rioter in the streets that the regime would have to worry about. Since 2021, the easiest way Cubans were able to do this was via Nicaragua, whose visa-free policy has been a head nod to those who wanted to gain a foothold into the continent from where they could head north. On February the 8th, though, Managua quietly revoked the arrangements, a move widely understood as a concession to Washington after Maduro's capture left the Ortega regime increasingly isolated and, if our sources are to be trusted, eager to avoid becoming the subject of our potential Nicaragua's next episode. That leaves ordinary Cubans with essentially two options: endure or take to the streets. And the regime has spent years making sure they know what the second one costs. The last large-scale protests, which date back to 2021, still loom large in ways that have prevented the current ones from escalating. Over 1,000 people were arrested back then, and many of them are still serving sentences of 15 to 20 years for little more than chanting slogans, including children. Cuba watchers sometimes invoke North Korea to explain how a government this battered can still be standing. And while it's not a perfect analogy, as the Cuban regime isn't anywhere near as insane or as brutal as the one in Pyongyang, the comparison can still offer something. Pyongyang demonstrated decades ago that a regime can survive extraordinary circumstances if its security apparatus remains cohesive, regardless of the opinions of the domestic population. Famine may have killed hundreds of thousands or even millions of North Koreans in the 90s, but the Kim family didn't blink. When it comes to most uprisings against dictators, the fatal blow usually isn't a mass protest, but the state losing confidence in itself, which usually takes the form of no longer being willing to pull the trigger on its own people. As of the time of recording on the 11th of March, there is no credible reporting of defections within Cuba's security services. Part of this comes down to the regime's own strategy to insulate itself. A late 2025 decree expanded military benefits, while supplies for defense-related units are explicitly prioritized ahead of civilian needs in the emergency rationing plan. And so far it's paid off. The state's rapid response units have demonstrated nothing short of an absolute conviction to deploy to every protest hotspot without reluctance. Then there's the Iran example. Although currently getting bombed by the US and Israel, the regime in Tehran showed despots everywhere just 2 months ago that you could put down gigantic nationwide protests in days, so long as you keep the military on side and are willing to kill eye-watering numbers of people. To be fair to Havana, it has never yet engaged in a crackdown remotely as brutal as the Iranian one, but the overall lesson of reacting harshly will not have passed them by. Still, things may be changing. The Cuban regime has always paid and fed the apparatus first, but this time, the reserves funding the officer corps are the same reserves approaching 0 hour. And once that hits, there is nobody coming to replenish them. Every other regime that has fallen to popular pressure has had one thing in common: a moment when the people holding the guns decided that the people giving the orders weren't worth dying for anymore. Whether that comes down to purely materialistic self-interest, ideological or religious commitment to the state, or something else entirely, may vary from case to case, but ultimately, a state where the men with guns are willing to use them is in a pretty strong position. And while we're not in the business of predicting the future, we have to imagine that if Cuba doesn't reach a deal with Washington by 0 day, we're going to see the commitment from the men with guns there be put to the test. After all, only time will tell whether the next step is a peaceful transition, a revolution, or the seeds of yet another military intervention. Thank you for watching.